What if the elevator you take every day hides a floor no one talks about? When Michael, a software analyst struggling with grief, enters the elevator at Court Tower, he expects nothing but another workday. But when the floor numbers begin to glitch and familiar faces start behaving wrong, he realizes something ancient is watching him. Trapped between psychological unraveling and a ritual older than the building itself, Michael must confront the truth buried beneath the 9th floor, a place that doesn't exist until it's too late. This isn't just a haunted building, it's a trap, and it knows your name. "Don't leave the elevator until you reach the 9th floor," he said, "no matter what happens." I stared at the man, unsure whether to laugh or feel unnerved. He looked out of place, disheveled hair, a wrinkled suit jacket, and an expression that teetered between panic and exhaustion. His eyes locked with mine, almost pleading. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the lobby, disappearing into the gray drizzle that hung over Philadelphia that morning. I stood there for a moment, blinking against the fluorescent lights overhead, wondering if I'd just been part of some elaborate prank, but something about his voice, measured, cracked, deadly serious, lingered in the back of my skull like a splinter. The lobby of Court Tower was just as I'd expected from a corporate building that boasted 32 floors and a reputation for vetting top-tier candidates. Polished marble floor, hollowed silence, and the faint smell of cleaning chemicals. A security guard at the front desk gave me a nod as I passed through the metal detectors. I pressed the call button. The elevator dinged almost immediately. Stainless steel doors slid open to reveal a surprisingly pristine interior. A small wall-mount TV in the top corner was displaying a muted weather forecast. Sunny skies all week, which felt like a lie on a day like this. There was a large rectangular mirror on the back wall, slightly warped along its edges, and a barely audible classical track playing overhead. Something string-heavy, almost hypnotic. I stepped in, the door sealing me inside with a quiet hiss. My thumb hovered over the panel, and I hesitated. My interview was on the 5th floor. I knew that. The email confirmation was clear. 5th floor, conference room B. But now, all I could think about was what the strange man had said. "Don't leave the elevator until the 9th floor." Ridiculous. I pushed the button for the 5th floor anyway. The elevator began its smooth ascent. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and tried to mentally rehearse my responses. I needed this job. 3 months of unemployment had burned through my savings. Meredith and I were already having quiet arguments, sharp, whispered tensions over bills, grocery receipts, whether we were still on track. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked fine. Tired, maybe. The faintest trace of dark circles under my eyes, but otherwise professional. Shirt, tie slightly crooked. I adjusted it. "Floor 5, the elevator intoned in a calm female voice. The doors opened with a whisper. The scene beyond was oddly welcoming. A receptionist sat behind a white marble desk, mid-30s, auburn hair tied in a neat bun. She stood as I stepped forward, smiling in a way that felt just a little too wide. "Mr. Reed, you're early. We've been expecting you." That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hadn't introduced myself. I'm here for the interview," I said, my voice catching. "Sorry if I'm too early. I can wait downstairs if—" "No need," she said, gesturing toward a minimalist sitting area. "We'll be ready for you shortly. Please, have a seat. Mr. Reyes is very excited to meet you." The elevator doors started to close behind me. On impulse, I reached back and held the door open button, unsure of what I was doing. Something felt off. Not dangerous, not yet, just wrong. The receptionist's smile didn't falter, but her eyes were studying me like a puzzle she'd already solved. I turned slightly, craning my neck to peer past the desk. Behind her stretched a wide office space, cubicles, buzzing computer monitor, the low hum of productivity. Normal. Completely normal. But in the far corner of the room hung a massive framed photograph. I couldn't quite make it out from this distance, but several employees were gathered around it, staring as though it were a revered relic. "I see you brought your lucky tie," the receptionist said suddenly. My heart stuttered. "What?" She tilted her head. "The one you wore in your college yearbook. Meredith always said it brought you luck." I froze. My mouth went dry. I had never told anyone about that, not even Meredith herself. That tie had been a private joke between me and myself, a tiny ritual I performed before important events. I hadn't worn it in years, but I had dug it out this morning, desperate for some invisible edge. "You've been thinking about starting a family, haven't you?" she continued, her voice light and pleasant. "If it's a boy, you'd name him Sam." The name hit me like a brick to the sternum. Sam? No one knew that, not even Meredith. Not even me, consciously, until just now. I backed toward the elevator, heart racing. "I think I left something in my car. I'll be right back." "No need, Mr. Reed," she said calmly. "Everything is ready. We're all so eager to see what you bring to the table." The elevator doors started to close again. I jabbed the open button. They resisted for a second, then slowly parted once more. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the office employees had turned to face me, all of them, all at once. And then they started to sing, "Happy birthday to you." The words came out in perfect unison, too perfect, like a choir of androids. A man in a gray suit stepped forward, holding a birthday cake aloft. Its candles burned blue. I turned. On the far wall, the photograph had become crystal clear. It was my senior yearbook photo, blown up to nearly life-size, eyes smiling a little too much. My feet moved before my brain did. I lunged back into the elevator and slammed the closed door button. Again. My finger jammed the plastic like a panic switch. Nothing. "Come on," I whispered. "Come on, damn it." At last, the doors began to shut. The receptionist's voice drifted in just before they sealed. "I've always wondered," she mused, "what do you really taste like on the inside?" Darkness, silence, only the quiet hum of the elevator rising. I didn't press another button. I couldn't, because every floor between 5 and 9 was now gone from the panel, and something told me I wasn't the one choosing where to go anymore. The elevator hummed quietly, climbing without urgency. I leaned against the mirrored wall, chest heaving, one hand gripping the rail as if letting go would send me plummeting into the abyss. My other hand hovered near the panel, thumb trembling over the glowing numbers. Only one of them still glowed. 9. The rest were dead, faded, as if they'd never existed. "Don't leave until the 9th floor," the man had said. But what if the elevator never stopped? What if it just kept going, past floors that weren't even built? I took a breath. No, that was insane. I needed to think. The classical music had stopped. No chimes, no announcements. The silence pressed against me like a blanket soaked in anxiety. I stared at the panel again. No emergency call button, no intercom, just a flat surface where the buttons used to be. I reached for my phone. No signal. Of course, but even without service, I could still see the recent call list, or maybe pull up something, anything, to feel less alone. I unlocked the screen. The wallpaper was gone. In its place was a black background with a single line of text. "Now arriving." At what? I wanted to scream. My thumb hovered over the power button, but I didn't press it. That's when the elevator dinged. A single chime, low and resonant, echoed through the space. The number above the doors flickered. 5, then 6, then nothing. The elevator slowed, but there was no number showing. My stomach twisted as the brakes hissed and the doors began to open. Beyond them, there was only blackness. Not darkness like a hallway without lights, but complete and total black, like staring into the mouth of a cave that had never seen light. I didn't move, neither did the elevator. I could still feel the cold air spilling in from the void. Then something moved out there. A soft, wet sound, a dragging step, something breathing. I jabbed the close button instinctively. It didn't exist anymore. The door stayed open. I backed into the corner, pressing myself against the far wall. My eyes scanned the opening, squinting into the black. Another step, and then nothing. The doors closed on their own with a whisper. The elevator resumed its upward motion, as if that had been a normal stop. I sank to the floor. No announcements, no buttons, no control. Whatever was in charge now wasn't human. My phone buzzed, not vibrated, buzzed. Like a high-pitched static that climbed in frequency, like a dentist's drill scraping the inside of your brain. I dropped it in surprise and it clattered on the floor. The screen lit up. Incoming call. Meredith, my wife. I snatched it up, heart pounding, thumb hesitating over the accept button. I pressed it. Meredith? Silence. Then a crackling sound. Don't go to the 9th floor, Michael. I stopped breathing. Her voice sounded like it had traveled through a dying radio station. Meredith? What's going on? How do you even know where I am? He lied to you. The man in the lobby. He's part of it. Part of what? This place. This ritual. There's no job, no interview. It's all bait. A trial. I leaned against the wall, knees pulled up to my chest. I didn't even care how absurd it sounded anymore. I just want to get out, I whispered. Then don't go to the 9th. The voice changed mid-sentence. It grew deeper, smoother, familiar, and foreign all at once. You've come so far, Michael. Why turn back now? I froze. That was not Meredith. It wasn't anyone I knew. I'm hanging up, I said, though my voice broke halfway through. You won't. And it was right. I couldn't move. My fingers trembled against the phone. I tried to end the call, but the screen was frozen. The voice kept speaking, not through the speaker, but directly into my skull. You were chosen. Out of thousands, you should be honored. The elevator shuddered, lights flickering. For a moment, the walls warped, bulging inward as if the space itself were breathing. Then everything snapped back. The screen of my phone turned off on its own. The call ended. And the number above the door lit up. 9. The chime sounded. Clear. Final. The doors began to open again. This time I stood. This time I had no intention of stepping out. But what I saw made me question everything I thought I knew about control. Because it wasn't a hallway this time. It was a room. White walls. Fluorescent lights. A reception desk. A woman standing behind it, smiling. Exactly like before. The same woman. Only she was already looking at me, as if she had been waiting. She held something in her hand. A small, black device. A button. She raised it slightly and tilted her head. Would you like your way out, Mr. Reed? I didn't speak. She stepped forward and placed the button inside the elevator, gently resting it on the floor like a gift. It only works once, she said, just like everything else that matters. Then she stepped back. The doors didn't close. I picked it up. It looked just like the missing panel button for the ground floor, tactile with a faint blue glow. This was it. My chance to leave, my second chance, my only chance. And that's when I heard footsteps behind me. Not from the hallway, from inside the elevator. You know, I've always loved taking chances, the old woman said. Too bad you didn't. I blinked. The image in the mirror was gone. My own reflection had returned, slightly distorted around the edges, but recognizably mine. Same tired eyes. Same sweat-slicked brow. The same silent panic blooming behind my stare. The button, the one the receptionist had given me, was still in my hand, glowing a soft, eerie blue. I didn't press it, not yet. I was too focused on the silence. It felt poised, like the air inside the elevator was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I turned back toward the open doors. The woman at the desk was gone, so was the reception area. Now it was just black again, like earlier, but this time, something about it pulsed, as if there was a heart beating somewhere inside that darkness. The doors slowly slid shut. Not because I told them to, but because it decided. The elevator resumed its motion without warning. It didn't rise, didn't fall, just moved. The sensation made my stomach twist, as though the floor beneath me was shifting in ways that defied physics. I tried to press the glowing button for the ground floor. Nothing happened. Its light dimmed, and then went out. I stood paralyzed, hands still resting on the panel. As a low chime rang through the cabin, the number above the door flickered once, then stabilized on, I didn't even know it existed anymore. The elevator slowed. Another chime. The doors opened, and she stepped in. She was old, easily late 80s, maybe more. Her white hair was pinned neatly beneath a floral hat, and she wore a dark overcoat, despite the non-existent chill. She carried a handbag clutched tightly to her chest and offered me a warm, almost grandmotherly smile. "Morning," she said, voice soft and pleasant. I nodded mutely, unsure how to respond. The doors closed behind her, leaving us sealed once again in the small metal box. She looked at the control panel, frowned, then turned to me. "I'd like to get off at the ground floor, please. I'm sorry," I stammered. "That button doesn't work anymore." "Oh?" she said with mild surprise. "Well, maybe the second floor then. It's been a while since I've visited friends." She reached toward the panel. "No, please don't," I blurted. "That floor isn't safe." She paused. Something in her expression changed. Her smile remained, but her eyes sharpened, as though peeling something back. Me, perhaps. "Is that so?" she asked gently. "And what makes you say that, young man?" I was told not to get off before the 9th floor. There's something wrong with the building." She gave a light chuckle. "Oh, darling, of course there is." Before I could react, she pressed the button for 2. It glowed red, not orange, not white, red, like blood under neon light, and the elevator obeyed. I backed away from the panel, heart racing, panic clawing up my throat. "We shouldn't be doing this," I whispered. "That place, it's not real. It's not right." She turned her eyes on me. "What is real, Michael?" My name in her mouth felt unnatural, tasted wrong. "I don't know who you are," I said, my voice trembling, "but please, don't get off there. I saw something earlier, in the dark. Something was there." The old woman smiled wider. "Oh, sweetheart, I live for the darkness." The elevator dinged. 2. The doors opened with a hiss, and it wasn't a hallway this time. It was a cavern. A damp, stone-lined cavern, lit by a distant, flickering orange glow. The floor was wet. I could smell mold, wet earth, and the unmistakable copper tang of blood. Somewhere in that dark, hungry space, I heard it again. Breathing. Deep, ragged, hungry. The woman turned to me, her voice honey smooth. "They've been waiting for you, too." She stepped forward. The reflection in the mirrored wall warped again. She wasn't just old. She wasn't just wrong. Her bones seemed to bend backward as she crossed the threshold, her form twitching like a puppet on tangled strings. I shouted, leaping for the panel, mashing the close button over and over, even though I knew it wouldn't work. The doors began to close, too slowly. A shape emerged from the cavern. A man, or at least something that wore a man's shape. His suit was immaculate, dark gray, neatly pressed, but his skin, what little of it I could see, was stretched too tightly over the bones. His eyes gleamed, but not with light, with hunger. He raised a hand and held the doors open. "Hey there," he said cheerfully. "Heading down?" My mouth went dry. He tilted his head. "I heard about you. They were hoping you'd go to 5, but I think I can make you a better offer." I didn't move. $800,000 an hour, he said, "starting today." That pulled me out of the fog. "You're joking." "Nope." He smiled wider. "But between you and me," he leaned in, his face inches from mine, "we don't actually pay you." I froze. "We just take your eyes so you don't have to see them." The word him hit me like a freight train. He lunged. I screamed. My hand slammed the elevator wall, hitting something, anything. The word him slammed the elevator wall, hitting something. And the doors, by some miracle, slammed shut. The man's fingers scraped against the metal with a screech that echoed down the shaft. The elevator jerked upward. I collapsed against the wall, hyperventilating. Silence returned. For now. The sound came again, soft at first, like the rustle of something crawling just behind drywall, but then heavier, more deliberate. Footsteps. Inside the ceiling. I pressed myself against the far corner of the elevator, head tilted upward, trying to locate the source. My pulse thudded in my ears. The fluorescent lighting flickered once, twice, then held steady, just long enough for me to catch the faintest impression of something shifting behind the mesh of the ceiling vent. A shadow. Moving. I stepped away. Not real, I muttered under my breath. Just tricks, just part of the show. But I didn't believe myself. I was still trembling from the encounter at floor 2. The old woman's warped silhouette, the cavern beyond, the thing in the suit that had nearly pulled me out. $800,000 an hour. Just your eyes. That wasn't a threat, that was a bargain. For them. A hiss of air escaped the ceiling, then the elevator jerked. Not the smooth lurch of machinery adjusting to speed, but the feeling of something grabbing the car and yanking it upward. The frame groaned. My knees buckled slightly as the lights dimmed. The panel glowed again. Floor 6. I hadn't pressed anything. I didn't even know if I could anymore. The doors began to open. I braced myself, ready to see another impossible hallway or nightmarish illusion. But what I saw was a kitchen. A break room. Dim fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead. There were vending machines against the wall, a stained microwave, and a small round table with 2 chairs. It looked dated, abandoned. One of the fluorescent tubes above flickered rapidly. There was dust on the countertops and a single ceramic mug sitting in the sink. It shouldn't have felt threatening, but it did. Because of the silence, because of the absence. No people, no movement, just a break room on floor 6, like nothing had ever happened here at all. I didn't step out. I was done falling for that. But the doors didn't close. Instead, the elevator waited, inviting me. I shifted my weight, glancing into the mirror behind me, only to find the reflection was frozen. Not lagging, not glitching, frozen, like a paused video frame. In the reflection, I was still facing the panel, hand resting on it, but I had turned around at least 10 seconds ago. I raised my hand and waved. The reflection didn't move. I took a step back, eyes locked on the glass, still no change, and then the reflection blinked. Not me, it, and smiled. My stomach turned. The lights in the break room flickered again, only this time something moved in the far corner. A person, hunched forward, slowly rising from behind the vending machine. I squinted. No, not a person, it was me, or something wearing my face. But its skin was loose, sagging, like a cheap Halloween mask stretched over too much bone. The mouth was too wide, the eyes, oh God, the eyes were milky white, like glass marbles soaked in milk. He reached out and waved. That's when I lost it. I hammered the door buttons. Anything, everything. I kicked at the sides, screamed into the ceiling, let me out. But the elevator didn't respond. Neither did the thing in the break room. It just stood there, tilting its head. Then it opened its mouth. I couldn't hear the sound. There was no audio, but the shape of the lips was unmistakable. Happy birthday. Slam. The doors finally shut. The room vanished. My own twisted double blinked out of existence. Silence returned. I collapsed to the floor again, sweat dripping from my temples, my chest rising and falling in short, shallow bursts. How many more floors? How many more versions of me? I didn't want answers anymore. I just wanted to survive. The elevator shifted again. This time it moved upward, fast, too fast. My ears popped. The lights flickered madly, cycling through yellow, blue, and a brief pulse of red before returning to white. I pulled myself upright and stared at the screen above the doors. It was cycling now, faster than my eyes could keep up. 13, 17, 21, 3, 45, 6, 7, 99, 8. It was a blur. Nonsense, a loop of numbers spinning like a wheel of misfortune. I turned to the mirror. It had gone black. Not cracked, not shattered, just pure black. A void, like a television screen turned off. But as I watched, a single image appeared, like a photo burned slowly into the surface. It was me, back in the break room, but this time I was seated at the table, smiling, eating, and something was sitting across from me. Something faceless, with long fingers resting politely on the table, mimicking a dining companion. The photo faded. The lights cut out. Total darkness. I couldn't even see my own hands. And then, just above me, came the sound again. Thump, thump, thump from the ceiling. No, now it was in the walls. The elevator shook violently. Sparks flew from the ceiling vent as something struck it from within, warping the metal outward. I backed away, fumbling in the dark. Something hissed, like steam or breath. And then, a voice, right behind me. "You've almost made it, Michael." "It's not your wife anymore, Michael," the voice said. "It's him. He wants to meet you." I didn't move. Couldn't. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry or even threatening. It was calm, patient, like someone standing behind me with both hands resting gently on my shoulders, waiting for me to surrender. The light inside the elevator had gone sickly, not red, not yellow. Something in between, like rotted parchment soaked in nicotine. I watched as the control panel flickered again. Every button now glowed, except floor 9. That one was dead. A black void among the constellation. But something was tapping from inside it. Deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails. I stepped back from the panel, forcing my spine against the mirror that had once shown twisted versions of myself. Now faded to static gray, my fingers twitched, itching to press any button that might bring this to an end. But a cold certainty had settled in my chest. Nothing I pressed would matter anymore. The tapping stopped. Then, buzz, buzz. My phone. I didn't remember putting it back in my pocket, but there it was, vibrating gently against my thigh. I pulled it out, thumb hovering over the screen. Incoming call. Meredith. My breath caught in the name. My wife. I hadn't seen her in over a week, not really, just text messages. Cold, short, tired. We were drifting apart like ice flows in the current, never really saying what we meant. I answered. "Meredith?" Silence. Then, "Michael." It was her voice. Soft, familiar, almost relieved. "Oh, God," I breathed. "I don't know where I am. Something's happening. Something's wrong with the building. The elevator. Meredith, I think I'm being followed. I don't know how to get out." She didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice cracked. "You need to listen to me. Whatever you do, don't go to the 9th floor." My stomach dropped. "Wait, what?" "He lied to you, that man in the lobby. He's part of it. They all are." "Meredith, how do you know any of this?" "I didn't at first, but after you left, after you got the email, I started getting messages, warnings. I didn't believe them. But then I started hearing things. At night, in the walls. They told me what this place really is." "What are you talking about?" Her voice dropped, became faint, like a whisper between two worlds. "There is no job, Michael. There never was. They called you here for something else. A test. A passage." My throat tightened. "But why me?" Silence. And then, another voice. Not hers, not human. It emerged from the phone line like mold blooming through drywall. "Because you're empty, Michael. Easy to mold." I dropped the phone. It hit the floor, screen side down, but the voice kept speaking, no longer through the speaker but through the walls of the elevator itself. So eager to prove yourself, so desperate to be useful. The panel lights dimmed. The walls pulsed inward. I could feel the air compressing, like the elevator itself was breathing in my terror. I bent down, grabbed the phone, and tried to end the call. The screen was frozen. A single sentence burned across it in red text. "Go to your interview." "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." The elevator shook violently. I slammed my hand against the panel. Nothing responded. Suddenly, the elevator lurched upward. Fast. So fast I nearly lost my footing. My legs buckled. I braced myself against the mirror, but it had turned hot. Painfully hot. I pulled my hand away. Skin reddened, the metal now almost glowing beneath the surface. The floor counter flickered again. 32, 45, 77, 121, 143, 209. The numbers blurred. Impossible. Unreal. I was moving through something, not just floors, but thresholds, layers. And then I saw it. Floor 840. The number blinked once, then held. The elevator slowed, stopped, and the lights went out. I stood in complete darkness. Nothing but the faint hum of something massive and alive just beyond my senses. The mirror was no longer reflecting. The phone screen dimmed. The panel dead. I was suspended. Between floors, between decisions, between versions of myself. Then a voice broke the stillness. Childlike, gentle. "Do you want to switch, mister?" I didn't answer. The air felt thick, wet, like breathing through cotton soaked in oil. The voice came again. "I don't want to stay here anymore. If you take my place, I can go home." I gritted my teeth. "Who are you?" Silence. Then, slowly, something began knocking. This time not from the panel, not from the ceiling, from beneath the floor. I dropped to my knees, pressing my ear to the cold metal. Knock, knock, knock. "Where is this place?" I whispered. "A space between decisions," the child replied, then softer. "But they already chose for you." The panel lit again. All buttons gone, except one. Interview room, blood red. Then the phone vibrated again. A final message glowing across the screen. "You are expected." I looked up. The elevator chimed once. Then the doors began to open. The hallway was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that made your ears ring with your own blood pressure, your own breath, your own heartbeat. The elevator doors were still opening, agonizingly slow. Like the space between them didn't want to release me, or worse, wanted me to watch what I was about to step into. I was still staring. At him. At me. Seated in a sleek black chair at the far end of the hallway, beneath a single cone of flickering light, was another version of myself. Hair combed, suit pressed, hands folded calmly in his lap. But it wasn't right. The smile stretched too far. The lips peeled back just a little too thin, and though I couldn't see clearly from where I stood, something about his teeth, gleaming and plentiful, felt wrong. There were too many. Way too many. Still, I stepped forward. I don't know why. My body moved before my mind caught up. Each step was rubbery, like walking underwater. The red carpet muffled my footsteps, but every few strides I felt something soft beneath the surface. Like walking on buried objects. I didn't look down. Not yet. The hallway was lined with frosted glass windows on either side, but no reflections, no walls beyond, only fog. And shapes moving just out of view, things pacing or twitching or standing too still. I focused on the figure ahead, myself. As I approached, he looked up. His eyes were my eyes, but there was nothing behind them. No fear, no confusion, no spark of thought, only patience. Endless, suffocating patience, like he had been waiting for me for years, or lifetimes. "Take a seat," he said, His voice was my voice, but smoother, perfectly modulated, like a corporate voice assistant had been trained on my speech patterns and given autonomy. I stopped about 6 feet from him. "I don't understand," I said. "What is this place?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached to the side and picked up a clipboard, passed it to me with one long, pale arm. It was a job application. Mine. But not the one I submitted, not the basic resume and PDF attachment from my email. This was handwritten, in black ink I didn't recognize, and it was far too detailed. Employment history, every job I had ever taken, medical records, listed in full, including the time I broke my wrist at age 9 and never told anyone. Psychological profiling, including thoughts I'd never voiced out loud, private things, ugly things. At the bottom, in capital red letters, approved for integration. "What does that mean?" I whispered. Other me tilted his head. "You've already agreed?" "I didn't." "You did," he replied, "when you stepped inside." A pause. "When you chose to go up." I backed away. No, this isn't real. I just wanted an interview. I just needed a job." "You needed purpose," he corrected. "You were wandering, unmoored, disposable. We don't waste things here. We reshape them." My throat tightened. "We," he stood, and that's when I saw it. His feet, bare. Not wrong in shape, but shadowed beneath the skin. Black veins pulse just under the surface, like roots crawling up from the earth and wrapping around the bone. And where his shadow hit the floor, it didn't stop at his feet. It kept moving, outward, toward me. I stumbled back. "You can't have me," I said. "But you've already been had," he replied, stepping forward. "You're here. You've lasted. You've endured. That makes you eligible." "For what?" He smiled wider. "For the next phase." And then, his face began to change. The skin pulled tight, the eyes shrank into deep sockets, the mouth widened until it reached the jawline and then kept going, upward, curving toward his ears. The teeth, dozens, hundreds, clicked together like chimes in a storm. I turned and ran, back toward the elevator. The hallway stretched as I moved. The carpet grabbed at my shoes like quicksand. The frosted glass on either side cracked, then shattered, revealing black silhouettes slamming against invisible barriers. I reached the elevator. The doors had started to close. No! I lunged, jamming my hand between them. They froze. I stumbled in, hit the panel. Every button was gone, except one, floor 9, backlit in crimson. I didn't think. I hit it. The doors closed. The elevator groaned, shuddered, began to descend. I collapsed against a far wall, gasping, watching the floor display count down. 21, 15, 10, 9. It stopped. The doors didn't open. I held my breath. The silence stretched. Then my phone vibrated. A new message lit the screen. "You made it." And beneath that, "But did you survive?" I looked into the mirror. My reflection blinked, then said without my lips moving, "He's waiting in the lobby." The doors opened onto silence. But it wasn't the comforting kind. It was the kind that sucked the air out of your lungs before the scream could ever form. The carpet beneath my feet had changed. It was no longer the blood-red velvet from the upper floors, but something softer. It gave slightly under my steps, like damp moss or thick flesh. The color? A dark gray, shot through with threads of black. I stepped out. The hallway was lit, but only barely. Flickering sconces mounted on the walls, shaped like old gas lamps, threw trembling shadows across wallpaper that peeled in long, curling strips. The patterns on the wall looked like vines at first glance, but the longer I stared, the more I saw faces, stretched and screaming, frozen in agony beneath the floral layers. A draft moved past my neck. I spun. No one. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I had crossed a threshold, that somehow the floor beneath me wasn't just a different level, it was a different realm altogether. I looked to the elevator. It was gone. Not just the doors closed, but gone. No buttons, no frame, just wallpaper and a sconce where the entrance used to be. I was in, fully. There was no going back now. I moved forward. The corridor led to a wooden archway. Past it, a spiral staircase descended into a large open chamber, dimly lit by candles that floated in midair. Not wires, no hooks, just fire hanging in the void, motionless, as though time had stopped. A stone platform occupied the center of the chamber. It looked like an altar, and surrounding it, in a perfect circle, were 9 identical figures, each dressed in long black robes, faces obscured by masks shaped like elevator buttons. 1 through 9, smooth, metallic, expressionless. I crouched at the base of the stairs, breath caught. They weren't moving, not breathing, not even swaying from the flickering candlelight. Statues or waiting? Then the one with the number 4 raised its hand. My spine locked. It had moved like liquid, too smooth, too synchronized with my thought, as if it knew I was watching. Michael Devlin, it said, its voice neither male nor female, filtered through some kind of reverbing static. You have reached the threshold. The others turned their heads in unison. I backed up, hand gripping the railing. We have prepared this place, said number 7. Long before your birth. I didn't speak, couldn't. You were chosen, added number 2. Not by us, but by the building itself. The building? I croaked. My voice cracked like a dry twig. Number 5 stepped forward, standing beside the altar now. The Andalcourt Tower was never built to hold people. It was built to hold a shape. What shape? They tilted their heads in sync, like birds. A pattern, whispered number 9. A containment sigil, a ritual of design and ascension. Every floor is a gate, every door a I felt dizzy. This wasn't a job interview. This wasn't a test. It was an initiation. You've opened too many doors, Michael, said number 1. You've looked too far down the hall. My heart thundered. You can still be useful, number 6 added, if you complete the rite. The rite? The candles dimmed as one, and from beneath the altar a slab slid open with a stone groan. Something rose, slowly, emerging into view. It was a mirror, tall, wrought iron frame shaped like writhing bodies locked in poses of pain. The glass shimmered, and I saw myself, but not just me. Now, I saw every version of me, Michael as a child, Michael at 19, angry and drunk in a college stairwell, Michael at 32, jobless, hollow, crying in his apartment at midnight. All of them flickering through the surface like channels changing rapidly. Dozens, maybe hundreds of lifetimes blinking into each other. This is your confession, said number 3. You must choose the self to leave behind. I shook my head. What happens if I refuse? The answer came not in words, but in the groan of the walls. They breathed. The chamber itself shivered. Then number 8 took a single step toward me. Then the building will choose for you. And somewhere above, I heard it. The ding of an elevator bell. Floor 1, then 2, then 3. Rising. It was coming down. Or something in it was. The elevator bell echoed again. Ding! Floor 5. A breeze rose from the stairwell behind me, like the whole building exhaled something cold and ancient. The robed figures stood still, circling the mirror, their numbered masks glinting in the candlelight. You must choose, number 3 repeated, voice calm like a priest at a funeral, sound version of you must die for the rest to continue. I stared into the mirror again. This time, the reflections weren't flickering. They stood beside each other, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of Michaels. All of them aware, all of them looking at me. The one in the middle stepped forward. He was cleaner, sharper, confident, wearing the same suit I wore during my first job interview 10 years ago. He smiled. You're not strong enough, he said softly. Another Michael stepped forward, disheveled, eyes rimmed red, hands trembling. the one who drank for 2 years straight. "Don't pick me," he whispered. "I'm already dead inside." Then another, bruised, bloodied, his face nearly unrecognizable. A version I didn't remember. A version who'd clearly been through more than I could imagine. "What are they?" I asked aloud. "Options," said number 9. "No," I snapped. "They're me." Number 5 stepped to the altar again. "The building holds many versions of you. Every step you took, every door you didn't open, all of them add weight to the structure. We call them echoes." "I didn't ask to be part of this." "You did," number 2 said evenly. "You stepped into the elevator, you climbed." Another ding. Floor 6. The room grew darker. One of the reflections turned to run. He didn't want to be chosen. His image collided with the inner edge of the mirror and shattered, like glass. His body split into ribbons of light and vanished into the iron frame. The candles flickered wildly. "Each moment you wait, the building consumes another echo," warned number 1, "until none are left." I backed away, breath shallow. The Michael in the middle, the sharp one, was still smiling. "You want me?" he said. "I'm the one who got things done. The one who didn't freeze at the moment of truth." I looked around. "Why me?" I asked the masked circle. "Why now?" number 6 answered. "Because the 9th floor demands inheritance. Every 90 years the tower resets. One soul must remain, must carry forward the ritual, must contain the echoes." My stomach dropped. "You mean I have to stay?" Number 7 stepped forward. "Only one version of you will. The others, burned, eaten, or scattered into the walls." "Jesus!" Number 3's voice cut through again. "Choose." I turned to the mirror. The confident one, Michael with the tie and smile, held out a hand, but another caught my eye. The boy. Me at 9 years old. He looked terrified, clutching a broken toy dinosaur, wearing a school uniform stained at the knees. He didn't speak, didn't plead. He just looked at me like I had the power to make it stop. And maybe I did. Ding! Floor 7. The shadows crawled up the walls now like oil slicks with fingers. I could hear something growling in the elevator shaft. A thumping, wet and angry, like something pacing behind a metal door. The robed figures raised their arms. "The time ends," they intoned. "The building awakens." I closed my eyes, chose. The sound was instant, like ice snapping under pressure. A scream, dozens of them, some mine, some theirs. The mirror shattered outward. I was thrown back against the stone, 1,000 shards embedded into the floor. The echoes were gone, all but one. I opened my eyes and saw myself standing above me, smiling. But it wasn't me. It was the Michael I'd rejected. The one who wore my fear-like armor. He stepped closer, tilting his head. "Thank you," he said softly. "You were never meant to finish this." I tried to speak, but blood filled my throat. The stone beneath me pulsed with heat. "Rest now," he whispered. "The tower's chosen." Somewhere the elevator dinged again. Floor 8. The robed figures began to chant. And as the walls closed in, I saw my reflection, what was left of it, smeared in the black glass of the altar's edge. It was still blinking, but it wasn't blinking back. I woke up on a couch that didn't exist, in a room that had never been mine, with memories I couldn't recognize, yet somehow I remembered everything. The light above me buzzed like an old hospital lamp, not blinking, not flickering, just buzzing, as if it were alive and unsure of its own presence. I sat up slowly. The room around me was sterile. Pale green walls, linoleum floors, one window. But it didn't show the outside. It showed a hallway with more doors and more lights and more buzzing. My head throbbed, not from pain but from overlap, like I was trying to contain too many perspectives at once. Was I Michael? Yes. But which one? I stood up, legs trembling. My reflection stared back from a sheet of reflective steel on the far wall. My face was slightly wrong. My left eye had a faint yellow hue around the iris. There was a scar on my right cheek I didn't remember earning. My tie was on backward, but my memory said this was right. This was how it had always been. There was a desk beside the couch. On it, source name, Michael Halder, assistant to the custodian, a black rotary phone, a thick binder with the words Tower Protocols, 9th floor, administration. I reached for the phone. Before I could touch it, it rang. Bridging. I jumped. I picked it up. Hello? Static. Then, Michael? Who is this? A woman's voice. I recognized it, barely. Don't trust anything past the window. What? Click. I looked at the window again. Behind the glass, the hallway was empty. Then the lights in the hallway blinked off. One by one, until only the door right across from the window remained lit. It opened, and I saw myself, smiling, calm, wearing a janitor's jumpsuit with a badge, Custodian Halder, Tower 9. He raised one hand, held up a single finger, then mouthed, "One left." The window fogged from the inside, but I was on the inside. I stumbled back from the glass, heart pounding. The desk phone rang again. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the binder and opened it. Protocol 9A, Echo Containment. Every 90 years, one inheritor must enter the 9th system. Echoes shall be called via the mirror right. The final version of self shall be granted custodianship. No entity is to enter from below after ascension. Lock all lower entryways. If unauthorized entry is suspected, initiate loop reset via Terminal 3C. My mouth was dry. I'd won, inherited the floor, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt like something else had won through me. Footsteps outside the hallway. I opened the door to my left. A corridor lined with filing cabinets and cold fluorescent tubes above. Something was breathing inside the vents. I passed faded signs, records, case files, memory incidents, temporal leaks. Halfway down, I found a door labeled Michael Halder, Identity Archives. I opened it. The room inside pulsed red. In the center, a pillar of glass rotated slowly, filled with flickering images. Faces of me at different ages. Faces of me at different rooms. Some screaming, some laughing, some frozen in fear. Each frame blinked once, then vanished. On a nearby monitor, a single sentence pulsed. "There are too many of you." Suddenly, behind me, footsteps. I turned. Nobody. But my reflection in the glass pillar was still there, watching me, smiling. Then he winked. I ran. Out of the room, down the hallway, lights burst one by one above me. Pop, 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 until I was under emergency red backup. When I reached the end of the corridor, a heavy metal door waited. Above it, elevator, administrative core. My fingers trembled as I pressed the button. Silence. Then, a ding. The door opened. No elevator inside, only darkness. But I heard something inside, breathing. Not mine. The elevator shaft was blacker than night. Not absence of light black, but presence of something black. Thick, watching, pressing. And yet, my foot stepped forward. One step. Then another. The floor didn't drop. Instead, as I moved inward, lights hummed on. Dim red strips lining the ceiling, revealing a chamber rather than a shaft. The space inside the elevator was wrong. It was wide, too wide, wider than the building should allow. A circle of mirrors surrounded me, each at slight angles, reflecting infinite versions of me, each one different. One wore glasses, one bled from the mouth, one had no eyes, one smiled with someone else's teeth. I tried not to look, tried to focus forward. A voice echoed, "Michael Halder, please proceed to Terminal 3C for confirmation." My knees shook. I walked across the mirrored chamber. Each step echoed twice. At the center, a control panel mounted on a pillar, glowing faint green. Terminal 3C reset loop. Beneath it, a button labeled Prune Identity Tree. I stared. Behind me, one of the mirrors rippled, like water. One of the Michels stepped out, but not into the room, into me. A rush of memories flooded my mind. His life, his choices, his screams. I saw his childhood, his death, his second birth in the floor. I collapsed. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't alone. 5 versions of me stood in a circle, watching, each with the same eyes, each whispering, "You're not the one who chose. You were chosen. You were the passive one, the weak one, the wrong one ascended." I scrambled back, breath ragged. No, I completed the rite. I did what I was told. "You did what you were allowed," one said. "But this place isn't ruled by obedience. It's ruled by intent." The janitor version, the one I'd seen earlier, stepped forward. He held up a key card. On it, "Halder Prime. You're just a placeholder," he whispered. "A version left to rot. You're the echo." I screamed and lunged for him, but I passed right through. The mirrors cracked. Reality shifted. I was no longer in the elevator. I was back in the lobby, but not the lobby I remembered. It was frozen in time, everything in gray tones. The receptionist sat motionless. The floor was covered in thin dust, but no footprints marked it, not even mine. I walked to the glass doors. Outside, the sky was static, literally, like an old television screen full of snow. A screen buzzed on behind me. I turned. A CRT monitor on the wall flickered to life. My face appeared. Then dozens of faces. A wall of me, each blinking in unison. "Choose," the monitor said. A single line of options. Prune, preserve, preserve, meat race. I reached for preserve. A jolt of pain struck my spine. My hand clicked prune. The room turned red. Screams echoed down invisible hallways. Hundreds of versions of me cut loose, deleted, dying a second time. My ears bled, my teeth ached, my stomach twisted. The elevator behind me reopened. Inside stood a single mirror. I stepped in. My reflection smiled. "I've been waiting," he said. "I'm done with this," I hissed. "But you're not done being me." He reached through the glass and grabbed my throat and pulled me in. I fell, not physically, but in layers. Memory peeled like wallpaper. I was 6. I was 32. I was 80. I was unborn. Then I wasn't. I stood once more in the mirrored elevator, empty. The mirrors showed nothing. No reflection, no Michael, just the faint whisper of the janitor's voice. Now we begin again. The elevator door opened. Ting! Outside, the office floor was back to normal. Bright, daylit, ordinary, and every someone was me. There was no floor, just a gaping blackness below, like the bottom had been erased from existence itself. Michael's eyes stung as the elevator lights flickered wildly, plunging him into a strobe-lit nightmare. The floor indicator above the door had frozen on 9, but the elevator hadn't stopped. It was descending into something else, something that defied gravity, architecture, even sanity. The walls began to bend, not physically, but perceptually, as though space itself had become subjective. He grabbed the side rails, knuckles white. Sweat soaked through his shirt, but he couldn't stop trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the creeping realization he wasn't in a machine anymore. He was inside it. The elevator was no longer descending. It was being pulled, like bait on a line. The girl from 7A had whispered something before her form dissolved. "You'll find the route on 9, but you won't walk out with it." Michael didn't know what that meant. Until now. Reveal the source of the ritual, the true purpose of the elevator, and the origin of the curse. Begin the process of acceptance or transformation in Michael. This 9th floor is not an actual physical location. It is a space that exists between memory, regret, and ritual. A nexus carved into the collective guilt of the building itself. The environment is unstable, shifting between corrupted versions of past events, dead tenants' echoes, and shadowed hallways. The walls throb like flesh at times, lights hum like insects, doors open into non-Euclidean spaces, bedrooms looping into closets that lead to kitchens from 40 years ago. Each doorway is a memory from someone's last moment in the tower. Michael, on the brink of breakdown, but beginning to grasp that the only way out may be through the horror. Janitor. Earl revealed as the watcher of the cycle, a semi-mortal who survived the curse but was twisted by it. He appears here in distorted form, revealing the truth. The woman from the photo, her presence begins to solidify, a spectral echo guiding Michael, possibly his mother, possibly the first sacrifice. The true ninth Michael steps out of the elevator, but what meets him is not a floor, but a dimly lit corridor stretched into infinity. The hallway feels wrong. The angles tilt slightly, the air tastes like rust and decay, carpet patterns flicker between decades, lights buzz as if reacting to his heartbeat, doors line the walls, each marked with cryptic symbols instead of numbers. As Michael walks, voices whisper behind each door, some pleading, others warning. He hears his own name echo down the hallway, but from a child's voice. The janitor appears at the hallway's end. The floor collapses into a spiral staircase leading downward. Illogical in a building with only 9 floors, Michael descends, and at the base, Earl, the janitor, waits, his body now deformed, like a human made of burned wax. He doesn't speak at first, only points to a map scratched into the wall. It shows Andal Court Tower, not as it is now, but as a kind of shrine, each floor a step in an ancient rite. Earl finally speaks. They built the tower wrong, not by accident. They wanted to contain it, but it leaked. Every year, every tenant, every button pressed. Revelation. The ritual. Michael learns that the elevator itself is a ritual device, built by a cult under the guise of an architectural firm. Every 9 years, a carrier is chosen, a resident whose trauma makes them porous. The elevator's descent awakens the root, an ancient entity buried beneath the foundations, feeding on unresolved pain and isolation. Earl says, "You're not the first, but you might be the last." Then he pulls out an old family photo. Michael, age 8, in the hallway of this very building. His mother in the background. She never left. Her disappearance had been ruled a runaway. But now, Michael remembers, the night she vanished, she entered the elevator during a blackout. Michael finally reaches a chamber that looks like the lobby, but covered in black roots pulsing from the ground. A massive shape looms at the center, bound in ritual markings in chains of flickering light. It speaks without voice, into his mind. It offers Michael a choice. Join the cycle as its next anchor, preserving the balance and ending his suffering, or resist and watch as the tower consumes the innocent above. Only the chosen may descend. The stench of ozone was sharp now, hanging in the elevator like scorched copper. The countdown above the doors pulsed red. 1. Michael's body felt weightless, his arms trembling as he tried to stand. The interior of the elevator was no longer metal. The walls had become flesh-like, pulsing softly, veins glowing faintly with some sickly bioluminescence. He didn't scream. There was no point. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He glanced over to see the woman in red, Margot, smiling again. But this time, her smile reached all the way to her ears. Quite literally. Her cheeks split open, revealing rows of translucent teeth, like a deep-sea predator. "You're almost ready," she whispered, her voice echoing from inside his skull. "You've seen enough to understand now, haven't you?" "No," Michael muttered, forcing himself to crawl backward against the shifting wall. "This isn't real. This is a hallucination." Margot crouched in front of him. "Reality is subjective here, Michael. We make our own laws in this place. And the tower remembers." Behind her, the elevator door finally opened, but it was no longer a hallway. It was a circular chamber, massive. The walls lined with doors, some rusted shut, others vibrating with low, guttural moans. In the center stood a stone pillar, etched with symbols that shimmered when he looked at them sideways, but vanished when he focused. Michael was pushed to his feet, not by hands, but by the floor itself. It rippled upward beneath him like a tide, guiding his feet toward the pillar. A choir of low voices began to hum, unintelligible at first, but slowly coalescing into words in a dead, ritualistic tongue. They weren't singing to Michael, they were chanting through him. "I don't belong here," he shouted. "I'm not one of you." Margot's voice, now disembodied, circled the chamber. "You came here of your own will. You ignored the warnings. You took the elevator all the way to the bottom." "No," he hissed. "I was tricked." "Then why did you press the button twice?" Michael faltered. His mind raced back. Yes, he had pressed the elevator button twice that first night. Once accidentally, once deliberately. The second press was just curiosity, wasn't it? Margot appeared beside the pillar, her form slowly unraveling. Her body peeled into long strips of fabric-like skin, flowing toward the stone as though feeding it. "Everyone who comes here has been chosen long before they know. This tower was built for the Seekers." Michael dropped to his knees. "I didn't seek anything, I just wanted to survive." The chamber responded with a roar, not from Margot, not from any speaker, but from the doors themselves. They began to open one by one. Out stepped the residents of the tower. They looked almost human, but not quite. Elongated limbs, smooth, featureless faces, bodies wrapped in ceremonial shrouds stitched from elevator carpeting and stained ceiling tiles. Each bore a different symbol carved into their chests, the same ones Michael had seen in the janitor's notebook. He tried to run, but the room shifted again. This time there were no walls, only the abyss. And then the janitor appeared. His face was no longer scarred. He looked composed, inhumanly calm. "You thought I was a madman," he said, "but I was only a messenger." "What the hell is this place?" Michael cried. "It's not hell, it's a filter," the janitor said quietly. "The elevator was never just transport. It was selection. This tower doesn't house the damned. It creates them." The resident stepped forward, forming a circle. Their hum returned, deeper now, a resonance that struck Michael's bones. "You're going to join us," the janitor said, "or take someone else's place. That's how this works." From the stone pillar, a shape rose. It was him, or rather, a duplicate of him, identical in every way except its eyes. They were completely black. The copy smiled. Michael turned, ran for the elevator. It was still there, now shining clean, doors wide open. The LED display flashed. G, ground floor. Could he make it? He sprinted. The residents did not pursue. As he reached the doors, he felt the space behind him distort. Air thickened. The copy was following, walking without touching the floor. Michael dove inside the elevator, slamming the closed door button. The copy stopped, inches from the threshold, lips moving. "You're already part of it." The door slammed shut. The elevator shot upward, this time faster than ever before. Lights flickered, numbers scrambled. 1, 5, 3, 8, 2. When the doors opened again, he was home, in the Andal Court Tower lobby. Sunlight streamed through the glass entrance. A receptionist was typing on her computer, the same one from the first day. Everything was normal. Michael staggered out. The world had returned. But as he stepped outside into the blinding daylight, something caught in his throat. There were no people on the streets, no sounds, no cars, only silence. And in the glass of a nearby parked van, he caught his reflection. His eyes were black. Thank you for joining us on this descent through the 9th floor elevator. In a world where shadows speak and reflections blink back, out of sync, we're reminded that the most terrifying places are the ones that feel just a little too familiar. This story was crafted with care, mystery, and a deep love for classic American horror, where cursed buildings, forgotten rituals, and fractured minds intertwine. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true, horror-inspired tales. And remember, if the elevator ever skips the number 9, don't ask why. Just get out. We appreciate your time, your curiosity, and your courage. Until next time, stay out of the shadows and watch your reflection.